What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to the show. It's Monday, June 27th, 2011 here. Start of a brand new week here. All kinds of psychotic stuff going on. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. But before we get into it, first of all, get some business stuff out of the way. The phone lines are open, 877-342-6673, 877-342-6673. Brett's in the control room, twiddling the dials, ready to answer your phone calls. I have to respond to this story that just came out of the news break that you just listened to about Michelle Bachmann and what a wonderful candidate she is, and she's in a statistical dead heat with Mitt Romney, and you should pay attention to her because she supports Israel, and pay no attention to Ron Paul, who's that troublemaker who wants to bring down the Federal Reserve. And it's a classic case of the media trying to convince you who the candidates are before you even get to the polling place. They're basically trying to control the election, to rig the election by saying, these are the approved candidates that you will like, and these people over here you should not pay any attention to. Now, obviously, Michelle Bachmann is already a zero in my book for a couple of reasons. First of all, her entire campaign seems to be unending support for Israel and its abuses against the Palestinian people. That alone should disqualify her, because right now, no government can serve two masters, and this country needs politicians who are concerned about our problems here, not out there saying, Israel this and Israel that. But that's the entire foundation of her campaign. As you're probably aware, last week we were poking fun at her. She's the new Sarah Palin, the brainless wonder, because she was up there in New Hampshire, my home state. I grew up in New Hampshire farming country. And she's up there saying, you're the cradle of the American Revolution, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord were fought here. Actually, the battles of Lexington and Concord were fought in Concord, Massachusetts, not Concord, New Hampshire. So there's strike two against her right there. So now, apparently, she's up there in Waterloo, Iowa, and was saying to Fox News, what I want them to know is that just like John Wayne is from Waterloo, Iowa, that's the kind of spirit I have too. Well, I hate to be the one to break it to you, little lady, but John Wayne is actually from Winterset, Iowa, which is about 140 miles from Waterloo, little lady. And the only John Wayne from Waterloo is John Wayne Gacy, and he sodomized and murdered 33 young men in the 1970s, and I'm not sure that's the kind of spirit you want people to know you have there, Pilgrim. So that's strike three on Michelle Bachmann. She's a brainless twit, and the only reason she is the darling of the media is she's sucking up to Israel. But she's clueless. She doesn't know American history. She doesn't know Iowa history. She doesn't know the history of entertainment, which I will grant is not a major factor in choosing a political leader. But she's out there pretending to have knowledge she does not have. If you don't know what you're talking about, Michelle, shut the heck up. Because you're embarrassing the entire nation, because the rest of the world are watching all these news shows about what a wonderful candidate Michelle Bachmann is, and they're all saying, is this the best the Americans can come up with? Is this all they've got to put out there to run the country? No wonder they're on the verge of collapse. Like we don't have enough entertainment value from Sarah Palin. Okay, on to the hard, serious news. Over the weekend, the flood control, the aqua dam, the sandbags, all the rest of that stuff around the Fort Calhoun nuclear power station collapsed. It failed. Water is into the power plant. We've had one report. It's already into the control room. The external power has been shut down because of risk to the transformers bringing power in from outside. They're running on the emergency diesel generators. They've only got fuel for 88 hours. And, of course, if the water continues to get into the control systems and shorts out the pumps or the emergency diesel generators or both, then we're basically looking at Fukushima in the middle of Nebraska. So for all of you people in Nebraska listening to the show, keep an eye on the corn growing out your window. And if it starts popping by itself, start running right then and right now. Of course, what we're getting from the government and media up there in Fort Calhoun is they're basically saying not to worry. There's absolutely no danger whatsoever. All situations are in control up here at the Calhoun nuclear power plant. There's nothing to worry about whatsoever. We're the United States government. Why would you ever doubt anything we have to say? Because we'll get back to you right here as wait a minute, what's that flashing red light? Now, I don't mean to make light of the situation because it's obviously very, very serious, but it is amazing. After all the lies that we were told about the Gulf of Mexico disaster, after all the lies we were told about radiation is good for you following Fukushima, after all the lies we were told about Saddam's nuclear bombs, and I know I'm mispronouncing the word. I do that because President George W. Bush always mispronounced it, and, he's the president, so I guess that makes it right. But no, this government told us, Saddam had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in there, and they're telling us all this other stuff. And so only, who's going to bet their life right now that the government is being 100% honest about the situation at Fort Calhoun? And the other reactor, Cooper, that's also at risk here. And the reason this is a very serious situation, yes, the reactor is shut down. It was shut down for refueling. The problem at Fort Calhoun, as it was at Fukushima, are the spent fuel rod cooling pools. And apparently what is really making this dicey is that Fort Calhoun was sort of the catch-all for the spent fuel rods that were piling up from the other power stations in the area. They've got this huge cooling rod facility where they've got all of these rods, and and they're already on the emergency backup power. And if that fails, they can't get fuel into there and the whole thing's already flooded, then, starting about 4 days after they run out of electricity for that spent fuel rod cooling pool, the coolant will have boiled off, and that's when we're going to start seeing the same kind of problems that they're having over in Fukushima. This is very, very serious, and I'm sorry. The government has destroyed its own credibility. I am not willing to take them at their word when they say that everything is going just hunky-dory out there, because absolutely cannot trust them about this very, very serious situation. They're already on the emergency generators. They've lost the outside power. One report that water was in the control room. And if that wasn't bad enough, we have, these huge wildfires out there in the west in New Mexico are very close to the Los Alamos laboratory, which has had to be evacuated. And obviously there's a lot of materials in there that would be very, very dangerous if they catch on fire as well. So, I don't know, maybe the Mayans were right. Maybe this is the beginning of the big kaboinga. It's not going to happen overnight. Or for those people who think that there is a divine presence up there, an invisible man in the clouds who makes everything happen, I think at this point it has to be understood he's sending a very stern, critical message to the people of the United States of America. Stop messing around with building nuclear weapons. Whether it's Los Alamos that designs them or these civilian light water reactors that are providing the fuel for these bombs, it's a big tacky no-no, and maybe it is time to stop. Now, over in Israel, as you're probably aware, we're coming up on this situation where Freedom Flotilla 2 is getting ready to sail to Gaza to break the Israeli starvation blockade of Palestine, specifically of Gaza. Now, we already know because of official Israeli government documents that were leaked by McClatchy News that this starvation blockade has nothing to do with Israel's security. Israel's a nuclear power. And all Gaza has to defend themselves with are basically bottle rockets. They're glorified bottle rockets, are all they really are. But what this starvation blockade is about, this is a repeat of the Soviet Union's attempted starvation blockade of West Germany back in 1947-48. The Soviet Union cut off all roads into West Berlin in order to starve the West Berliners into surrendering their own elected government and accepting Soviet rule through their proxy in East Germany. This is exactly the same thing. Hamas won the elections in Gaza back in 2007. And Israel's very upset. We didn't give you an election so you could vote for people we don't like. And so they imposed a starvation blockade with the goal of starving the Gazan people into surrendering their elected government, their own chosen government, and accepting Israeli proxy rule through Fatah. Now, at this point, it's almost moot, because Fatah and Hamas have shaken hands, and they're getting ready to go into the United Nations in September and declare a Palestinian state. But Israel, because of its societal hubris and arrogance and chutzpah, can't back off. They can't drop the starvation blockade, because then everybody will say, oh yeah, I guess it really was because they wanted to starve the Gazans into surrendering Hamas. Israel has been maintaining this facade that it's all about Israel's security, so they have to keep the blockade up. And now the flotilla is getting ready to go there, and it's going to be a public relations disaster for Israel, and they're fighting dirty trying to stop it. We'll have details after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So let me basically back up here and explain why this flotilla is a disaster for Israel, regardless of what happens from this point forward. The instant the flotilla sets sail, Israel is backed into a corner. They can't drop the starvation blockade without admitting that it was all about forcing the Gazan people to abandon Hamas. They can't, if the flotilla gets through and brings the food and medical supplies and books for the kids and candy and all that kind of stuff into Gaza, it is seen as a political defeat for Israel and a failure by Israel. It makes Israel look weak, and Israel doesn't want to have that happen. But if they use force to stop the flotilla again, it is also a public relations disaster, because the entire world sees this gigantic nuclear-armed nation, the sixth most powerful nuclear force in the world, backed up by all this American weaponry and American tax money, basically, interdicting these aid workers. And the last time they did it, a year ago, and innocent people got killed, and Israel came out with all these lies explaining, oh, they had knives, they had pointy sticks. They had all this other, and the lies basically fell apart. They were caught faking audio tapes. They were caught faking video footage, trying to basically say, yeah, they were terrible. They deserved it. They really deserved everything we dished out to them. We had no choice. We had to defend ourselves. And then, of course, the video surfaces of the 19-year-old kid from New York. Basically, on the deck, they're kicking him, and then they shoot him in the head. Yeah, looks like real self-defense there. Or as Ron White would say, you're a real manly man. And so now Israel's out there saying, we absolutely promise we're not going to stop the flotilla, physically, we're not going to have physical contact with them. We'll find other ways to stop the flotilla. Maybe they're going to be out there with that LRAD sound generator, and people will just put their fingers in the air, and that'll be that. And Israel went to the point of saying that any reporters who were on the flotilla, their camera gear and all of their electronics would be confiscated and would not be returned, and they would be banned from visiting Israel for 10 years, which for a reporter covering the Middle East is a major hit. And I pointed out earlier in the day, well, if Israel is not planning to do something very bad to the aid flotilla, why are they banning the reporters? Wouldn't they want the reporters there to document that everything was done according to international law? And I guess somebody in Israel read that, because just before we went to air, Israel came out and said, we've changed our mind, reporters are welcome on the flotilla. Now, that may be rather pointless, because Israel is resorting to dirty tricks and legal maneuvers. They don't want the flotilla to even sail. Israel's personal interests are best served if the whole thing gets called off. They have been trying for weeks now to find some way to get other governments to do their dirty work for them. They may have succeeded with Greece. We'll get to that in a little bit. But there's a lawsuit in New York where somebody claiming to be an American victim of a Palestinian terror attack has basically gone to court and asked the U.S. government to seize all of the flotilla ships as aiding terrorism. And, of course, the United States government is out there saying, oh, yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and, anybody sailing to take them cookies for their children, that's an act of supporting terror. And they've basically gone as far as, the U.S. government has basically gone as far as to say, look, if Israel comes in and kills you, it's your own fault. We're not going to do anything to save you. I can imagine how Teddy Roosevelt would have reacted if the nation that he once was president of was abandoning their citizens like that. But collectively, they're hitting the panic button. Israel cannot survive the flotilla sailing, regardless of the ultimate outcome of what happens to the flotilla. Whether they get through or Israel stops them again, it's still going to be a public relations disaster for Israel. But they can't back off. Their national identity, their national character won't allow them to do that. They're stuck. They had that top officer in the Israel's Navy saying, we're going to go in there and we're going to smash them. And once they make that statement publicly, they can't back off. So they're really stuck. Now, some of the things Israel's doing to try and derail this whole situation. There was a video floating around end of last week about this supposedly gay activist who was denied a place on the aid flotilla because of his sexuality. And they were out there waving it around saying, oh, they're discriminating against gays and blah, blah, blah. And coming so soon on the heels of the exposed phony lesbian bloggers in Syria, we should have understood up front that it was probably suspect. And it turns out, yeah, it's another fake. The supposed gay activist is actually an Israeli actor. And he was hired and paid to make this video. It's right out of Netanyahu's office. They're trying lies, smears, propaganda, whatever. They caught 2 suspected Israeli agents trying to sabotage the engines of one of the boats at the Freedom Flotilla. And this morning, one of the other boats was discovered that the propeller and propeller shaft had been sawn off under the water. Obvious sabotage. There's no question that, somebody in scuba gear went down and cut off the ship's propeller. Now, unfortunately, that is a repair job that's going to take a couple of weeks in a dry dock, so that boat is not going on the voyage. And the important lesson here is to remember that with Israel playing dirty tricks like that, phony gay videos, sabotaging the engine, sawing off the propeller, Israel cannot proceed. They cannot claim the moral high ground in this debate. Not when they're playing dirty like this. They can't claim that they have the moral high ground in this debate. Not when they're doing dirty tricks like this. They love to play dirty on this thing. Now, the last report that we got, and I have not gotten a confirmation yet. I've got an email into Ann Wright, fellow Hawaii resident, who is there on the Audacity of Hope, the American boat. The last report that we got is that the government of Greece basically got bought. They're in such terrible trouble for money, and that they are basically refusing to allow at least 6 of the ship to leave port tomorrow. And that's basically it. We'll write off so much of your debt if you will prevent the boats from sailing, and the Greek government apparently hoard themselves to Israel along those lines. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, speaking of Greece and their financial problems, which may have been the lever that Israel used to get them to basically refuse to allow several of the flotilla ships to leave port, and I guess Israel's agents are busy trying to drill holes in the bottom of the remainders right now. In a somewhat surprise upset vote, as you know, the Greek government barely survived a no-confidence vote last week, and this was expected to clear the way for this horrendous austerity program, which basically, in a nutshell, is going to tax the Greek people into absolute poverty, give all the money to the IMF, and then take everything that the Greek people collectively own and sell it off. But apparently several million Greeks, and you know what a hard time they gave the Nazis, have been glaring at their government through the front windows of all those buildings. And apparently a lot of people within the Greek government are saying, if we vote yes for this thing, the bankers will love us, but they're not going to come in here and put themselves between us and a very, very angry Greek people. Because what Greece is talking about with this austerity program is auctioning off all the beaches, all their casinos and palaces and airports and museums and the marinas and all of the infrastructure. They're basically, they get suckered into this private central bank model that by design increases debt always in excess of available money. It's designed to sink a people and a nation deeper into debt, and now that they're deep into debt, now that the private central bank has done what it's designed to do, the government of Greece, rather than give up their cushy jobs, is saying, yeah, take the airports, take the beaches. You can have them all and then rent them back to the Greek people who paid for them all and owned them in the first place. That's what's going on here. The private central banks, they create money out of thin air. It's just paper and ink is all it is. And then they use that faith-based money that people are taught to believe represents something of value to first crash the economy of a country and then strip mine the real wealth of the targeted nation. That's what they're doing to Greece. And they're doing it to Greece because the Greek people haven't realized that there is a different way to handle this problem, which we saw up in Iceland. Maybe they need more active volcanoes in Greece or something to start throwing the bankers into. But the warning situation is here because after Greece gets strip mined and looted, they're coming here to the United States of America. That's what all of this mortgage-backed security fraud was all about. That's what all the Federal Reserve is all about, is to plunge you deep into poverty, the government deep into debt, and they're going to come in here and say, well, the only way to solve this is you have to give us the Grand Canyon and Yosemite and Yellowstone and the Kennedy Space Launch Facility and all the beaches except for the ones with the oil on it. And anything left in the Midwest that hasn't been washed away by then. That's what it's all about. They foist this worthless paper money, this debt-based currency on the country, plunge the nation into debt. They bribe the government to go along with this scam. And then they offer us a solution saying, we'll let you off of all this debt. You just have to give us basically everything that the nation has. All the lands, all the public lands, all the beaches, all the highways. They're going to take all of this stuff that your taxes bought and paid for, and they're going to take them all and then rent them back to you. You are on the verge of being tenants in the nation your ancestors built and bought and paid for, because the corrupt Congress and corrupt president in 1913 sold you into the slavery of a private central bank. So over in Greece, the Greek parliament may reject this whole austerity measure. And you know between now and when that vote comes in, there are going to be threats and there's going to be bribes and there's going to be blackmail by the bankers to get the legislators to vote this package through, because that's what the bankers want. And the legislators are going to do whatever puts the most profit into their own pockets, and they're going to screw over the Greek people, which may trigger a revolution there as well. Because we know that if the Greek parliament rejects the austerity measures, the entire euro is going to collapse, and the European Union with it. They'll fragment and go back to being their own country, saying, maybe it's a better idea if we just issue our own currencies for a while here. But we got to keep an eye on what's going on in Greece. And the fact that Greece is working for Israel to derail the aid flotilla shows you that when you buy the lie that these pretty printed pieces of paper have value, then you have to sell yourself to the people with those printing presses. And that's what's going on here. And that's why Israel can go into Greece and say, you better not let that aid flotilla leave your port. We'll write off this or that debt. It's easy for them to write off the debt. It doesn't represent anything. Do you understand what would happen if the American people stood up to the Federal Reserve and said, we're not going to pay off all this accumulated debt? What would the owners of the Federal Reserve lose? Not a whole heck of a lot. It's not like they put silver or gold out there for you to borrow. It's just paper and ink. And they still own the printing presses, and they still own all the banking buildings, and they still have all the computers they use to run this scheme. If the American people stand up and say, we're just not going to pay off that 14 or 20 or $27 trillion in accumulated interest debt, it's not like it's anything real that will vanish. The owners of the Federal Reserve are going to be just as wealthy the next day. They just won't have control over you and your children and your grandchildren. And the people of Greece need to understand that. Now, obviously, all over the European Union, we've now got the Greek army is talking about a military coup rather than allow this austerity thing to go forward. And if that happens, that might be the next step in this global revolution against the global banking cartel. It started in Iceland. It's been to Egypt. Could happen in Greece next, then Spain. Sooner or later, it's got to happen here. And I'll tell you why. Because just think for a moment with this whole situation. I know we're coming up on July 4th. We're supposed to be patriotic and love our country and all the rest of that good stuff. But just think, if you spend your entire life working yourself to death to turn the money over to the government, so the government will give it to the bankers, and even though it's impossible to pay off the debt, you pay off enough of it where the bankers will say, all right, we'll let you keep Grand Canyon another year. And at the end of all that sacrifice, you don't get to send your kid to a good school. They have to, have bargain dental work, cheap glasses. You're living in a small house instead of a big, comfortable house. After all that sacrifice, what are you going to get? You're going to get exactly what you've got now. A government that doesn't trust you, that has crotch gropers at the bus stations and the airports and the train stations, that's spying on you, reading your email, looking at everything they do because they're terrified of you. The more you do for this government, the more they have to repress you because they're scared of you. They know that somewhere down the road, you will find your anger, your rage, your dignity, your self-respect. No matter how much the government looks at you naked, there's going to be a point where you're just not going to care anymore. And you're going to stand up and say, okay, enough. We need the Iceland solution here in the United States of America. We need to go Cairo on them. Whatever euphemism you want to know. But the money junkies and trying to set up this global banking dictatorship, this fascist dictatorship, they have literally set the stage for what could be a global revolution, and Greece might be next. Meanwhile, surprise, 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 China has taken... Oh, got to take a break here. We'll be right back after these commercials.
We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We got a couple of things to cover in this segment. And by the way, on hour number 2, Claire will be joining us to talk about Petraeus and some comments he's made about torture that are frankly quite a bit at odds with earlier statement that he's made on that subject. So we're going to be talking about that in hour number 2 and a lot of other things. But 2 things I want to get to this segment. In what appears to be a major surprise. Remember about a week ago we were talking about how Ben Bernanke had cranked up the printing press and just made up these wads and wads of spending cash for China to buy back the accumulated U.S. government debt from China. They're just inflating the debt away, and China apparently went with it, figuring they better grab it and spend it now because in a little ways down the road, it's all going to be worthless anyway. And China brought some of that money back in, and they're investing in hard assets inside the United States of America, land, facilities, that sort of thing. But apparently they're taking most of that cash, and they've gone over to the Eurozone, and they're going to help prop up the euro. And they're basically getting into long-term investment in European bonds. They're dumping their American holdings. But they're going to go over to Europe, and they're putting the money in there. And this is doing 2 things. One, it's certainly helping the euro, regain its footing. And hopefully it will bring a bit of a return for China. But what it's really, the real aim of this thing, the end result, is America's influence over Europe is reduced. The European Union and the European Central Bank have been very dependent on the IMF, which is pretty much tied in with the United States of America and the Federal Reserve. But now China is coming in and they're saying, we're going to throw some money at you to bail you out of your problems. And that means that the European zone is going to be paying a lot more attention to China's interests than the United States. Brilliant play by China. Game, set, and match. They have succeeded without firing a shot in undermining America's influence over Europe. And I'll bet you Bernanke wasn't thinking that was going to happen when he cranked up that printing press again. And yes, of course, China has cheated in the great game of global domination. They cheated. They kept their manufacturing. So, we'll see what's going to go on there. Now, down there in Texas, the legislature finally passed the anti-TSA bill, but they basically gutted it before they passed it. They weakened it. And they basically said that you had to demonstrate that the touching of your genitalia by the TSA was intentionally inappropriate, which, of course, is an impossible burden of proof. When somebody's running their hands all over your body, you know, how do you know it's inappropriate? They're getting their jollies. Everything's, you know, hey, I'm looking for bombs here. So they passed it. It's not going to really have much of an effect on the TSA, but, of course, it's going to be very useful for those who voted for it during their campaign speechification going into next year's election. That seems to be what it was. It was just grandstanding. They're trying to look like they're standing up to the federal government, but they are, in fact, doing nothing of the sort. Meanwhile, TSA's latest depth, just when you think the TSA cannot get any more disgusting, they find a way. So we have this situation where this Florida woman, 95-year-old woman, cancer victim, in a wheelchair, was forced to remove her adult diaper in order to go through airport security. 95-year-old woman in a wheelchair, cancer victim, and they made her remove her adult diaper to go through security. Obviously, this woman's a major serious threat to airline safety. So take off that darn diaper and expose her for everybody's view. While you're at it, drop and break her laptop and sell her iPod on eBay, because this is national security. Now, there's another story, and this is where things are starting to unravel here, because internal emails between the Department of Homeland Security and the National Institute of Standards and Technology that were obtained by the Electronic Privacy Information Center indicate a little bit of a disagreement regarding a USA Today article published November 15th, 2010, in which Janet Napolitano, the head of Department of Homeland Security, claimed that the National Institute of Standards and Technology had affirmed the safety of the airport scanners. Remember, we've got MIT and Johns Hopkins saying these scanners they damage DNA because of a process called molecular resonance, not well understood, just coming to understand that low energy radio waves and X-rays can in fact cause damage. Even though they lack the energy to specifically break a molecular bond, they can basically rattle the molecules so they start shaking apart, like the Galloping Gertie Bridge up there in the Tacoma Narrows. Resonance does affect molecules the way it does affect large macro structures. In the private email communications, the National Institute of Standards and Technology came back and said they don't do that kind of testing. They didn't test or affirm the safety of the scanners. Napolitano just made it up. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the reason this is coming up is because TSA workers are starting to show statistically greater occurrences of cancer than the general population. And this became an issue over at the Logan Airport in Boston, where the TSA workers there are apparently coming down with all these cancers. And they think they've got a little cancer cluster there, and they're trying to basically say, you know, is it the scanners? And Napolitano's saying, no. NIST says the scanners are safe. And NIST is saying, we didn't say anything of the kind. We don't know where you got that. We did warn you, TSA workers. We did warn you. And I have no sympathy for you, not after the way you've treated me and my wife and my laptop. But we did try and warn you. Remember back in the 1930s and 40s and even the 50s, they had these fluoroscopes in the shoe stores of America. And the United States Surgeon General not only said these things are safe, they created films to go out and say, you've got to use these things to guarantee the proper fitting of shoes to your feet as you go out there and you work in the factories and on the farms, and we're going to make you more productive because that way we can get more tax revenues from you. And then in the 1960s, the shoe store salespeople started all coming down with cancer. They started coming down with cancer, and it turned out it was from these fluoroscopes that the government had said was safe. And so now the TSA operators, and we did warn you, and I don't have a smidgen of sympathy for you. Not after the way you've been acting. Not after the way you have been, lording it over the American people, that you have the right to look at us naked, and you have the right to go into our electronic devices, and you have a right to just strip us of our personal dignity and our self-respect and our pride. So don't expect any sympathy from us right now. So you're all getting cancer from these machines like we told you was going to happen. Do you think the government is going to pay your medical bills? They certainly didn't when they marched those soldiers into a nuclear test in Nevada just to see what would happen. And what would happen was they all got sick. And the government said, well, that's what happens in war. And it left these people to basically rot and have to pay their own medical bills. So all of you TSA workers who thought you'd solve your unemployment problems by putting on those little rubber gloves and groping people all day long, guess what? You are already walking dead people. And the medical costs from these little scanners are going to bury you and your family permanently in debt. Welcome to my world. The government, in order to protect its money and its investors and the security industrial complex and all those members of Congress who are invested in Michael Chertoff's little operation, the Chertoff Group, they will indemnify themselves like they did with the vaccine makers, with the thimerosal. They'll say, oh, we know it's harmless. And, we've paid all these scientists to say that it's harmless. And we did try and warn you, TSA. We tried to warn you. You didn't want to listen because you wanted to believe the government. You believe the government when they said these machines were safe. You believe the government when they said Saddam had nuclear weapons. You believe the government when they said the economy was on the mend. See, this is why I tell you belief is a really lousy way to organize your brain. Okay, we're going to go to the phones. We've got Ben in Nebraska. Aloha, Ben. Welcome to the show. I hope you're not glowing in the dark yet.
My fingernails are kind of glowing, but other than that, I'm all right.
Okay, good.
So,
shouldn't finger paint with those phosphorescent paints.
Oh, dear. You're hilarious, Mike.
Well, thank you. We're almost at the end of the break, so you got to get to the point of the call.
Oh, okay. Just real quick, I'd like to recommend anyone to Rye on the Radio. It's a really good podcast. He's hilarious, too. I've listened to about 3 episodes, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to listen to really cutting-edge political radio. So wanted to recommend that. And
okay, well, you succeeded in doing a free ad on my show here, but we'll cut you a little slack this time because you may be downwind from the next nuclear disaster. All righty?
All right.
Thanks an awful lot. We're gonna let you go here. Yeah. Everybody wants a free ad on the show here. And it's not that I don't want to promote people, and I do promote people from time to time. I just want you to call me first and say, is it okay if I plug XYZ? And 9 times out of 10, I'll say yes. But if you just call in to put an ad on the air, the reason I'm going to shut you down is it's not fair to the people who are paying to have advertising on the show or on the website. And we actually sold our first radio ad. It's going to be going on the air on July 1st here. So we're actually making progress. It's our first actual paid ad in 4 years of radio. I'm going to put a candle on a Twinkie later on tonight for that. All right, that's it for hour number 1. We're going to take a break here for news and other things. And when we come back, Claire will be joining us to talk about this very dangerous direction that Petraeus is planning on taking as head of the CIA. So stay tuned with us. We'll be back in about 7 minutes. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2 today. And if you're watching us on Justin TV, you will see behind me Claire, who is a regular guest on our show. And have you done this on the Renz show? This is your first or second time?
This is my first time.
This is the first time with the Jeff Renz show. And but obviously was sitting in that same chair for many a segment of the show on the network. Yeah. So anyway, I'm aware that you had a very serious concern you wanted to talk about today. So why don't you just launch right into it?
Michael, thank you. I read something last Friday of course, I didn't quite read it in corporate American news. It was a foreign news service with an English translation. And I remember looking at it and thinking, it's way too far away from April Fool's for this to be a joke. And yet it really did happen. On Thursday, David Petraeus, the CIA director in waiting, asked Congress on Thursday to clarify how far interrogators can go in inflicting pain on detainees in quote-unquote special cases. Now, folks, I don't know if that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up and start to tap dance. It did mine. And I kept thinking, he is going to be the head of the CIA. Why in the world would he be making this statement? What is he, if you will, preparing or grooming Congress for? And we've got to have some definitions here. The people who Petraeus is calling detainees are prisoners of war. Plain and simple, they are prisoners of war. And as a career military person, I was flabbergasted. I was gobsmacked that he made this request of Congress. And there are a lot of reasons why I very clearly differ from his asking Congress about this. Because first, torture of any kind is morally wrong. And second is, in many, many cases, it doesn't produce the outcome that the torturer wants, which is real and hard information.
I mean, I'd like to step in here for just a little bit. I mean, the reality is, and most people who are involved in that line of work, I mean, the moral issue is really kind of secondary. It's simply not practical. When you are engaging in torture, what you're going to get, the victim of the torture is going to say whatever he thinks the torturer wants to hear to get him or her to stop the torture, and that is the reality. What is really alarming about this situation is Petraeus was formally on the record as being opposed to torture for that very reason, that you cannot get reliable intelligence under torture. You're going to get a lot of imagination. You're going to get a lot of people being named who are really innocent, who are then brought in and tortured as well. It gets completely out of control, like the witchcraft hysteria in Europe, where people were tortured and said, yes, my cousin Betty was dancing naked on the crossroads, and Betty gets brought in and is tortured and says, yes, my aunt, Wilma over there was, staring at the cow that died. And it feeds on itself as a self-justifying machine. So for Petraeus to do this turnaround shocked a lot of people. And it was rather interesting because Keith Olbermann was talking about this situation, and he came out and he said, this is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, and he's absolutely right, because Petraeus was out there, with this, we've heard this before, if there was a need to address, you have the individual has placed a nuclear device under the Empire State Building, it goes off in 30 minutes, and he has the codes to turn it off, wouldn't you torture him to get it? And it's such a contrived story, and the idea is that if you're okay with torture under those circumstances, that you should be okay with torture under any other circumstances. And first of all, that's nonsense. Second of all, that scenario has never happened, where there's a bomb about to go off and somebody has the codes to turn it off. Because if you're planting a clandestine nuclear weapon, whether you're a terrorist or the nation of Israel in New York at their embassy, you're not going to have a shutoff key on it. That defeats the very purpose of nuclear terror. Think about the movie True Lies. That scenario is realistic. They've got a stolen warhead. They've managed to break into the security to activate the warhead and set it to go off in so many hours. Then they dump it in a hole, pour in the quickset cement, so you can't even get at it, even if you know where it is.
Absolutely.
I just want to make this point here. If you're a terrorist and you're going to set off, if you're putting a nuclear bomb underneath the Empire State Building, why would you even add a shut-off mechanism with codes on it? It adds complexity. It adds cost. There's the possibility that that part of the system might fail and derail the whole thing. I mean, not somebody turning it off, but just the chip fails and it shorts out and the whole system stops working. You want this thing to be as simple as possible. No, there's not going to be a shut-off. The scenario is not going to happen. This is something that they make up for the TV series 24 Hours, which was this huge propaganda effort to get America to go along with torturing Arabs.
Absolutely. And in fact, in researching this, I came across an article written by a former FBI interrogator, Jack Clunan. And he says torture just does not work. It simply breeds jihad in the Middle East. And the guy is right. And he says categorically that torture does not help collect intelligence, but that it does sell impressionable people on the legitimacy of jihad on the grounds that a regime that tortures deserves to be attacked. And if, in fact, and when the U.S. institutionalizes torture, as it seems to have done with President Obama, remember, it was introduced by President Bush, but the use of torture has been institutionalized by President Obama himself. And when the U.S. government institutionalizes torture, it walks away from any human rights treaty to which it has ever been signatory, including the Geneva Accords. It shows that the U.S. government has an utter contempt for human rights and human dignity, because in torture, you're observing those rights only in the converse, in the breach. It also gives any nation that is hostile to the United States a carte blanche to torture American soldiers and American citizens. And particularly with those of you who are serving our military right now or have family, friends who are serving, please think about this issue, because it is really, really important.
Yeah, it is very much so. We have family who are serving. And our concern is that if the United States is basically saying, yeah, we've got the right to torture anybody that we capture because they might have information that's useful to us, then what happens when your son, your daughter, your brother, your sister, your wife, your husband, your niece, your nephew is captured by the other side and subjected to torture? We don't have, we've lost the moral right to say, please don't torture our people. The other side's going to say, you're torturing ours.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it. And there is a related case that I would like to mention this afternoon, if I may. The Supreme Court will not hear the Iraqi contractor torture case. On Monday, they allowed this case to be dismissed, and it was against military contractors who allegedly tortured people at the Bagram prison, which was a big, awful, horrible, ugly thing that happened. We probably don't know anywhere near the worst of it. But in their decision, the Supreme Court said that these contractors were exempt from being tried and also invoked national security. And you have to wonder, how soon will what we are seeing out there in various other countries come to the United States of America? And it appears to me, Mike, that our legal system has broken down, has developed a schizophrenia, if you will, and it's three different parts. One is justice alleged for enemy combatants or people who might be doing some critical thinking about any issues. Maybe they're peace activists who, wouldn't hit a flea. The second is for corporate America and the very wealthy corporations, which I'm sure the leaders of these corporations sighed a sigh of relief, knowing that the Supreme Court was going to dismiss this case. And the third is for, well, you and me and everybody else out there just trying to earn a living. And I think we need one standard of justice for everyone.
Well, that would be the ideal, but of course the whole point of tyranny and dictatorship is that you get a scaled justice system. There's one set of laws for the people, and then everybody above a certain level, they don't have to play by the rules. That's what wealth and power buys you in any corrupt society, whether it's, very wealthy celebrities able to murder their wives and get away with it scot-free, or as we see these military contractors engaging in torture. Never mind domestic law situations. We're looking at violations of international law.
Yes.
And yet the courts are saying we don't want to look at it. It's going to open up doors we don't want to go down, and it's
opening up the proverbial can of worms.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of worms in this one. And you're absolutely right. We don't know the worst of what went on in these torture centers. We do know from Binyan Mohammed that far worse than waterboarding is being done to these people, and the courts obviously don't want that to come out. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and we're talking about the very bad direction the country has gone, where our government is engaging in torture. They're certainly lying to the people. They have absolutely neglected taking care of this country in the rush for war and Israel and bailing out Wall Street. And Claire, you had a concern along these lines leading to torture about the emergence of this idea of thought crime.
Yes.
Shades of the Nazis.
I think that we are starting to see, if you will, a devolution into what you could probably call Code Napoleon law, where one is considered guilty until one is proven innocent. And for people like me who are not in any way, shape, or form terrorists, except that I like to think, people who have quiet, logically reasoned arguments against a number of the government's position are, I believe, soon going to wind up on various lists of people who are un-American, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I am very concerned about what I see as a trend toward this, especially with all the data mining going on.
Well, it's funny you would mention that, because one of the stories, we had two stories that we ran on the website today that I was going to talk about today, where there's this new company that is offering as a service to prospective employers. If you go to a large corporation and you apply for work, this company will basically go out and search everything that you have written on the Internet for the last 7 years and produce a report for your potential employer. And the guy who's running this used to run something called Checkpoint, which had their own issues where they were putting out intentionally bad information on people and just messing with anybody who wasn't towing the corporate governmental line here. Now, personally, I would not do business with a company like this, nor would I hire anybody who lacks the courage to speak their mind, because sheep make really lousy employees.
Right.
Okay. So what this is, though, this, along with this, Microsoft has apparently patented the idea that they're going to put eavesdropping backdoors into all their online voice over IP texting communications like Skype. Like we believe they aren't already doing it. But now they want a patent on it so they can collect royalties and residuals from whoever's using it, because peeking at your communications is now really big business. So, but what it is, this is actually a bluff, because it doesn't matter how many computers and how many spooks and the government has. They can't listen to everybody, nor could they lock up 300 million Americans for having very strong ideas. This is a bluff. It's a propaganda trick to scare you into staying quiet. Oh, don't write down on the Internet that you think the government is wrong to be torturing people, because that might show up on your job application somewhere down the road. Like, I wouldn't work for a company that is not going to value the First Amendment right to freedom of thought and expression, which is really what this comes down to. They're trying to say, yes, we have a First Amendment, but they're trying to scare you out of actually using it. And it's very, very underhanded. But if we have a freedom of expression guaranteed by the Constitution, then we have a freedom of thought. We're allowed to think anything that we want, no matter how weird and bizarre. It's only when you put it into action against your neighbor that, the law has to come in and say, you shouldn't really be sneaking into their house and painting giraffes on her toenails when she's sleeping, that kind of stuff. So this idea of thought crime and trying to scare us out of our First Amendment right to freedom of expression, it's just another sign of the attempt to build a dictatorship, a Fourth Reich here in the United States of America.
And that is absolutely terrifying. I think that like-minded, logical people need to find ways to find forums where they can express their feelings and their thoughts freely, like this radio show, and like the website.
And like your local bar.
Yeah, well, that too.
The Green Dragon.
Yes, absolutely. And you will be amazed. I was at church yesterday, and I was speaking with one of the greeters, and I was talking to her about these wars without end. And she was an older lady, very sweet. And she said, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. The level of agreement, we are... we're not the fringe anymore. We're leading where American expectations and hopes might be going in terms of cutting down these wars, not torturing people for any reason whatsoever, and making this country a better country that can thrive, because businesses are encouraged to grow here and thrive here, and it's made to work, and it can be. It's just dysfunctional as all heck right now.
It really is. But what we're doing here in the alternative media is we have won the war with the corporate media for the minds of America. We're setting the topics and the agenda. We're refusing to allow the corporate media to tell us what the issues are going to be for the coming election. They're waving gay marriage all over the place. New York passed a law and everybody's screaming about it. They're desperate to try and pull you off the focus of the economy and the wars, and we're not going to let that happen. And the reason they're coming out with this stuff about propaganda to scare you into staying silent is because the government understands the more that you go out and you find the courage to speak out about what's going on, the more you will give that courage to other people. And if everybody's out there talking with their friends and neighbors about what a disaster the wars are, how badly the government has managed the economy, how terrible the Federal Reserve has been for the nation for the last almost 100 years, then the corporate media, the TV stations, and the newspapers can't lure you back into thinking that Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann or gay marriage or any of this other stuff is important. And they're desperate to do that because they understand if the American people decide for themselves what's important in the nation, then the government and the corporate media have indeed lost control. Anyway, we're almost at the end of this segment, and I know you're going to head on out. Is there anything you want to say as a kind of a wrap-up to the audience?
Just everyone be very aware of what's going on, not only locally but globally. Be 7-day awareness. And watch what happens when Petraeus actually does obtain that position of head of the CIA. It will be very interesting to see where he goes with the desire, obviously, to inflict pain through torture on prisoners of war.
Well, the good news is the first person they tortured has confessed to blowing up the Hindenburg and personally shoving that iceberg into the path of the Titanic. We're going to be back after these commercials. Stay tuned. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we are getting a very alarming report from New Mexico regarding the Las Conchas fire. There's a mandatory evacuation for all of Los Alamos now. The alarming part is, the government is saying, oh, everything's fine, all the nuclear materials are safe inside buildings and so forth and so on. Well, what they're not talking about is an area called Area G. This is a dump site, and it's been in use since the late 1950s. And basically, this is where they take all these 55-gallon drums of contaminated materials, cleaning solvents, chemicals, toxic materials, and they're all contaminated with plutonium from the manufacturing of nuclear weapons. And there are something like 20,000 of these drums stored in this Area G. They're underneath these tents, cloth tents, to protect them from the sunlight, but they're just stacked there. And the idea was there was supposed to be this permanent radioactive waste disposal site and this processing plant to deal with it. None of it's come online, and like all these other nuclear facilities, this stuff just piles up and piles up and piles up. And the Las Conchas fire is only about 3 miles away from this huge area filled with these 20,000 55-gallon drums of plutonium-contaminated waste. How did the U.S. government let things get this out of control? Oh, we've got to have the bomb. We've got to have the big bomb, and it's so big and it's so wet, and don't you just want to lick it? And they're so focused on getting their bombs and their weapons and their depleted uranium munitions and the more kill per dollar and all that other arms stuff that just gets them all hot and bothered. And they're not realizing that these weapons that they're designing to bring ruination and waste and death and destruction to foreign nations are already doing that here in the United States of America. The reason the government put so much money and loan guarantees into the style of fission reactor that we see all across the United States of America is because they are useful for producing fuel for nuclear weapons. That's why these spent fuel rods from all of these reactors are so dangerous. They're loaded with plutonium. And they take some of the fuel rods and they'll refine the plutonium, and that's what goes in the bomb. But there's a lot more of these spent fuel rods than they have need for weapons right now, especially because of all these arms limitation treaties. So the reason that Fort Calhoun is of such concern is a lot of other reactors have been storing their fuel rods there. And now it's flooding, and they're on the emergency cooling. And that's a real serious situation. Now we're out here in New Mexico, the Las Conchas fire. They can't get it under control. The United States cut the budget for water bomber aircraft. We have to rent them from other countries. And especially in New Mexico, it's hard to find a lake nearby to go load up and throw the water over the fire. And remember what we talked about last week, this fire retardant chemical, this bright orange powder that they drop from the airplanes. It turns out it doesn't actually work. $30 million a year they spend to this company in Israel that makes this fire retardant that drops from the airplanes, and they can't actually confirm that it really slows down the fire used out there in the real world. And so now all of these little cracks and shortcomings and corruptions are coming together, and the Las Conchas fire is about 3 miles away from 20,000 55-gallon drums full of plutonium-contaminated, highly flammable chemicals. Ooh, gee whiz. George in Texas, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike? I hope you had a great weekend.
Well, we're having a really good weekend. Boy, am I sure glad to be out here in Hawaii right now. You know, I mean, between Nebraska and New Mexico, you got to be nervous sitting there in the middle of them down there in Texas.
I'm praying for the wind to blow it towards Washington, D.C.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That would really be wonderful. Instead of fire retardant, can we drop congressmen on the fire? That probably smother them out. I mean, they're really big.
Oh, that's a lot of manure.
Well, manure's flammable. Maybe that isn't such a good idea.
Yeah, but anyway, I read a story about what's going on in Peoria, Illinois. They're talking about these flash mobs going around threatening to kill Whitey, intimidating people and all that stuff. And you know, the thing is, I'm wondering, where is the Justice Department investigating hate crimes of these people? Because I would tell you one thing.
They're not. No. This is another one of these staged things to make racism the issue for the 2012 election. Okay? These flash mobs, they're hired. They simply go out and flash whatever they're paid to flash. And like I said, I've been telling you all along, the incumbent politicians are desperate to have issues they can run on that are not the economy and not the wars and racism and gay marriage and all these other things. That's what they're going to fan up. And that's what this whole thing in Peoria is all about. It showed up as a crisis only in time for the election.
Well, it's just, if Tea Partiers did that, I'll tell you one thing. You could get it off the news. Everybody jump on it.
Well, I don't know that everybody's jumping on it. I mean, you know, it's all theater. They have people who will stand there and be interviewed on the news and say, oh, yes, this is important. This is what we... It's like what Israel did with that actor. Say, yes, I'm a gay activist, and they wouldn't let me on the flotilla. It's all theater. It's all public relations. And I used to see it, you know, I worked in advertising many, many years ago. I won a Clio and everything. It's up there somewhere under the dust. And you would see public relations firms and ad agencies would go out and they would actually create a news story about whatever it was their client wanted them to sell. And they'd simply go to the TV station with an already made tape. And the news station would say, okay, sure, it's a free news story. We don't have to pay to produce it. And they'd run it as straight news. And unless you were really paying attention, you would never realize it was actually a placement by a public relations firm. You know, that's why you'll see news stories about things that, like, say, why are they even reporting on this thing? Well, somebody probably paid to put it in there.
Well, I remember seeing a national organization of women. There was only like not even a dozen people out there, but they had a TV camera there, and they all bunched together with their signs.
Oh, yeah, you'll see that. Anytime they talk about protests and everything out there, and we have, you know, if it's a tight shot on maybe 20 people, it means nobody showed up. There's nobody in the background, because if you've got a really good crowd, the first thing that news cameraman is going to do is throw a wide-angle lens on there and step back to show everybody, like we saw in the streets of Cairo and we're seeing in the streets of Madrid. If it's 20 people and a bunch of signs right there tight in the foreground, it means nobody really showed up. It's a rent-a-mob at best.
That's about it. Yeah, and another thing, I'm very disappointed that they watered down that bill in Texas. I wanted that bill to have teeth.
Well, I'm not surprised that it happened. It's one of these compromises. The people want the TSA to go away. Now they're going to be dying, so it's kind of a moot point. And, you know, Perry wants to run for president, and he wants to be seen as a man who stands up for human rights and decency, but he also understands that if he directly challenges the federal government, his election is, you know, DOA. And so this is the compromise. It looks like we stood tough against the government. We didn't really change anything, but by golly, we meant well, so vote for us in 2012. We're going to take a break. Thank you for the phone call, George. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're getting a lot of stuff sent to us about this horrible fire in New Mexico. It's now at 44,000 acres. It is 0% contained. This thing is totally out of control. Los Alamos is now under mandatory evacuation. They're telling people do not go to White Rock because that may be evacuated soon as well. The fire is actually on Los Alamos National Laboratory property. Apparently it's jumped New Mexico State Route 4 heading north, and it's actually directly threatening some of the lab facilities. And again, the concern that we're getting from people in the area is this dump site. This 20,000 to 30,000 drums, 55-gallon drums full of highly flammable and toxic chemicals that are all contaminated with plutonium. They're just sitting there. They've been left sitting there waiting for somebody to come along and say, yeah, we figured out what to do with all of this stuff. And the fire is now about 3 miles away from that. So that is just a real ugly, ugly situation here. All right, we got a caller on the line, Mike from Florida. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, you just recently said that the plutonium from the reactors can be used for nuclear weapons. I'd just like to point out that you need a moderated reactor in order to produce weapons-grade plutonium. The plutonium
light
that comes from these,
yeah.
The plutonium that comes from these is contaminated with the isotope plutonium-240. With too much of that, it is not viable for nuclear weapons.
Well, it can be refined, though. It can be refined. If you have the reactors that are...
The enrichment of uranium goes from 238 and separates out to 235. That's difficult enough. If you try to separate 239 and 240, it is almost impossible. They do not enrich plutonium.
Okay, but the point is that these spent fuel rods do have plutonium in them, and if they are exposed to air.
I just wanted to point out that they can't be used for making nuclear weapons.
Well, I will look into that, but on the other hand, you know, if it weren't for weapons development, I think we probably would have been better suited to go down the road toward thorium-cycled reactors, which do not produce weapons-grade materials at all and cannot be diverted for that purpose.
Oh, yes, I'm a big fan of molten salt reactors myself.
Well, the issue here, though, is the push for nuclear power has been, at least in part, to allow cross-support of nuclear weapons development and deployment. And as far as what is possible or not possible, you know, you and I are not privy to the latest and greatest technology in weapons creation. We do know that both Bush and Obama did authorize the construction of new tactical-sized nuclear weapons, and they're getting the fuel from someplace. So thank you very much for the phone call, and I'll look into that issue about exactly what the materials can be diverted for, or if it's just waste that is piling up. But one thing is very clear. If these spent fuel rods or these 55-gallon drums should catch on fire, everybody downwind breathing the smoke is in serious, serious trouble. A speck of plutonium too small to see, if you inhale it or ingest it, it will give you cancer. And even without the radioactivity, it is a very, very toxic metal. It causes all kinds of strange chemical reactions going on in there. All righty, so moving right along here, let's see. We talked about snitching on you for everything that you say, and backdoors in Skype. And at this point in the United States of America, it's probably best to presume that the government has something, on your phone, on your email, on your voice over IP. We understand that, Facebook has been caught yet again giving out private information for people on their Wi-Fi. The iPhone has been scandalized by keeping a record of everywhere that you go for years on end, and it goes on and on and on. We are living in a surveillance dictatorship where the government wants to have the means to keep track of you wherever you go. Now, me personally, I don't have any secrets. The government's problem is they can't shut me up, let alone keep any secrets here. So at this point, I don't care if they're listening. And it doesn't bother me anymore. And probably ought to be the attitude for you. The reason for this advertising of the fact that they're listening and that they're going to keep records and they're going to keep tracks and it might affect your future employment is to scare you into staying silent. One of the most brilliant movies I've ever seen is Brazil by Terry Gilliam. And there was a huge fight between Terry Gilliam and Universal Studios between the way he wanted to make it and the way Universal Studios decided was safe for the American people to see. It's since come out in a director's cut. But there was one of the scenes that was cut out of the original version but was put back in for the director's cut is after our hero gets grabbed and taken to be tortured. And they've got him strapped in the chair, and he's about to be tortured for whatever it is he's supposed to know. And one of the guards strapping him in says, don't fight the torture too much. It'll affect your credit rating. And that's where we are right now. They're saying, don't talk about how bad the government is. It'll affect your future job prospects. It's the same thing. We've come full circle. If you haven't seen Brazil by Terry Gilliam, you've got to see that. I had to start keeping a required video list for whatreallyhappened.com, and Brazil would be on it, so would Wag the Dog, another film that you've got to see. It's just an amazing situation here. Now, there's this bizarre story out there where the United States government, in order to allow local utilities to save a little bit of money, are going to stop mandating that the power grid regulate and keep accurate the 60 hertz frequency coming out of the wall. Our AC power flips back and forth 60 times per second. In the very earliest days of television, believe it or not, TV sets in cities used that wall signal as their vertical synchronization. That's why NTSC TV, in the days before high-def TV came along, NTSC TV had 60 fields or 30 frames because they used the AC power to synchronize all the TV sets. The idea was that the television transmitter and cameras and all the TV sets were on the same power system. It wasn't all interconnected all across the country. Well, that changed, and TV had its own internal synchronization, but that's where that frame rate comes from. Every clock that plugs into the wall uses that 60 hertz signal to say, okay, I'm keeping accurate time. So if the U.S. government decides that power companies can let that frequency wave back and forth a little bit, then it means that all clocks that plug in the walls will no longer keep accurate time. There are certain types of precision AC motors, like telescope clock drives, will stop working properly. They'll start wandering all over the place. I'm sure it'll be a boon to clockmakers who will sell clocks that will plug into the wall but use some other standard for timekeeping. I know down here at the Office Depot and the Sam's, they sell these clocks that say, we listen to the atomic clock time and we will keep accurate forever. There's only one problem. Here in Hawaii, that little transmitter they have to keep the clocks accurate over there in Denver, Colorado, doesn't reach out here. And I keep going to these store managers and saying, do you understand that that clock will not work in Hawaii? It says right on the back, will not work in Hawaii. And the guy says, well, we're not allowed to make those purchasing decisions. These come to us from corporate headquarters, and this is what they want us to sell. Life in America here. So this is really kind of dangerous because the efficiency of transformers fluctuates with that frequency. They're designed to work with 60 hertz, and if the frequency starts drifting between, shall we say, 55 and 65, we're going to start seeing major line voltage fluctuations. It's a bad idea. It probably sounded good. Yeah, they can get rid of all that special regulatory equipment and not have to maintain it anymore. But in the long run, I think it's going to cause a lot more damage than good. Now, speaking of causing a lot more damage than good, we're almost at the end of the show here today. There's this story on the website, and you probably ought to go and read it for yourself, and it says, Evolution Machine, Genetic Engineering on Fast Forward. And basically, this is about this scientist, this Harris Wang, who's invented a new process for creating new organisms for genetic engineering. It's apparently too busy to go in there and actually try and splice specific genes into the organism. So what they're going to do is they're going to take the target organism and a bunch of DNA, and they're putting it in this giant blender. And they're going to shake it around, and they're going to look at what comes out and see if anything's useful. And I cannot tell you how incredibly dangerous this shake-and-bake approach to creating new organisms is going to be. They're going to basically come out with this whole new bunch of stuff and say, well, that's useful, and that's not, and that's not. And the knots are going to get thrown away. And all they have to do is let one of them go wild, and we're going to have some major, major problems on our hand. They're already being incredibly reckless with these designed-to-specification organisms. Now they're going to come out there and basically just spin this genetic roulette wheel and say, well, let's see what the heck comes out of this thing here. It's a very, very reckless thing. It's driven by profit. It's money junkie thinking. We're spending too much money for these new, come up with a way to come up with these new organisms faster because we got to get to market here. So, by now you have probably heard about this vacationing retiree came home and found his house empty. The bank foreclosed on the wrong house. This is getting to be epidemic. Banks are foreclosing on the wrong homes. They're taking the possessions out of the home. They take them to a landfill, or they take them to the Goodwill, and they can't get their property back. And their house is empty, and they can maybe get the property back, but all of their memories, their personal items, they're gone forever. And the banks are saying, well, golly gee shuckies, we're sorry. Man, oh man, oh man. Last story here, and this is basically coming out here. There is a growing awareness that a lot of America's own history is pretty ugly. And this story is surfacing where Michigan, some lawsuits have been prompted. Michigan was sterilizing people in the early 1900s and as late as 1970s. And when you talk about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany and their race hygiene, and they're trying to breed pure Aryans, Hitler got all those ideas from the United States of America in the 1930s. And so we got to stop going along with saying, ooh, they're bad and we're good, because actually we're all kind of equally bad. And we're not really going to get good until we're all willing to be equally good. And stop saying they got to change before we change, because that's never going to get us anywhere. That's it for our show. We'll be back tomorrow here on the Rense Radio Network. Until tomorrow, stay safe, stay well, stay skeptical, stay angry. Hug your loved ones, and aloha, America.